I'm Enid Logan, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Minnesota. Well, everyone wants to do the IAS Residential Fellowship because it is a semester that you can have some time off from teaching in order to really think intensively about your research project. And then unlike the summertime, you don't just have to think about your research project on your own. You can think about it in conversation with other people throughout the semester, which is very cool. Okay, so I think of my project as being on indigeneity and race. It was first called American Indian Racialization and the Sociological Study of Race. And I got really interested in this area because I'm a scholar of race relations in the Americas. I've tended to focus on Blackness, but the degree to which I wanted to be able to talk about Native American or Indigenous people's experience, it was harder and harder because I realized that there's very little theorization of race in sociology, and our ways of thinking about race and racialization do not connect to American Indian experiences, which are actually foundational and fundamental to the construction of race in the US. So this seemed like a really profound gap. And then so I was very interested in working, and I've been working with a graduate student, Brianna Waters, who's interested in similar topics. So we've been working on trying to theorize how can we think theoretically about what it means to say that indigeneity has been racialized and how it's functioned in comparison to, for example, the racialization of Blackness in the US. Okay, so I started out thinking about just working on a theory article, which would be when I would try to theorize the racialization of indigeneity. And also have it be a critique of sociology and kind of the limits of the race paradigm in sociology it was currently constructed. But then it kind of developed into a lot more than that in ways that were really generative. And I was worried though for a time that I was just becoming really scattered, and I was just getting too many different ideas that weren't coming together. And then I met with Jennifer Gunn, who is the faculty director of the IAS this term, and also in talking to other people here, they really kind of convinced me that no, you have just a lot of really useful light bulbs going off, and you're making a lot of good connections, in part by thinking about your own work in such a concentrated way, and also having this kind of interdisciplinary form. So I have this core theory article, and then I started to think a lot about the body, and the body is connected to racialization. So I had started doing this a few years ago, thinking about the Black body and racialization, but there's so much that went on with Indigenous people and the physical body as part of the regime of racialized control over time that I thought would be really useful to think about the body and race also connected to indigeneity. And then when I had my IAS presentation, which was pretty early, it was October 15th, for that presentation, the main project I presented on was kind of a brand new one, and it was about Indigenous ancestry claims among white and Black families in the US. And it was really drawn to this topic in part because I also work on race and politics, right? And so one of the things that I had been talking about was Donald Trump's attacks on Elizabeth Warren, calling her Pocahontas and questioning her Indigenous ancestry and her claims to have been part Cherokee, and then looking into that and finding out, oh, well, there's a whole history of whites claiming Indigenous ancestry. Let's think about what this means sociologically. This was super interesting to me because growing up, this was part of my family lore, this idea that my family was part Indigenous, and that on my mom's side, I had a grandmother, a great-great-grandmother who was Cherokee, right? So when I was growing up, I just thought this was something about my family. Then maybe about 15 or 20 years ago, I find out, oh no, this is a characteristic, typical myth in Black families. And then just within the last year, I found out, no, actually, this is something that white families do too. So I was like, oh, okay. So then this makes me think, about race and indigeneity in really interesting ways that are connected to my longer standing interest in race. Like thinking about racial categories as co-constructed, right? So it seems clear to me with so many white families claiming indigenous origins or a native grandmother, and so many black families, that the idea of being part Indian is part of what it means, is part of whiteness in the US, and it's definitely part of blackness in the US, right? So it's definitely part of black identity in the US to think of yourself as being part Indian, right? So these categories are constructed very much in relationship to each other. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is thinking about how these things work, right? Or what's kind of how they work socially, or what these claims accomplish for these families, for individuals, or for the social construct of whiteness and for blackness. And I think that they work in really different ways. So some prominent explanations for indigenous ancestry claims among whites are things like it's a way to be more interesting ethnically, right? To say you're a part indigenous. It's a way to kind of sidestep some of the history of white supremacy or white privilege by saying, okay, you have an indigenous ancestor who, you know, suffered through some kind of discrimination. There's a third one. Those are the main ones, right? For black families, these explanations don't work, right? It's, you know, a way to be more ethnically interesting or a way to distance yourself from white supremacy. They don't work, and also I know that, like, my sense, I feel like it has to do with how we try to, as black people, try to make sense of slavery, right? And try to make sense of the legacy of slavery. In black ancestry lore about indigenous origins, it's always about phenotype. It's always about hair texture and skin color, right? Or it might also be like, you know, cheekbones and nose or something, right? Because I was convinced that I had this Native American nose. But the emphasis in American Indian ancestry lore is always on, okay, this is like Big Mama, and she had this like long, straight, luxurious hair, and it's from this Cherokee ancestor, right? So it's much more appealing to think of yourself and think of these particular physical characteristics that are associated with like beauty and nobility, right, as coming from an indigenous ancestor, rather than coming from being a product of slave rape, right? And so it's interesting when you think about, well, where did the supposed ancestor come in? It's always during the antebellum, during the era of slavery, etc., right? So there's just so much richness there that I'm really interested in exploring, you know, through this particular project. And I'm actually probably going to be taking on some undergraduate research assistants to work on this particular project with me next term at the same time that I'm continuing to develop this kind of broader project of theorizing race and indigeneity, and also thinking specifically about the body, indigeneity, and blackness. I loved having like an hour and a half to talk about my work with other people, and it was super fun. So the project I presented was the one I just talked about on the ancestry claims, and everyone was like super interested. I feel like for me, what was cool was not just the interdisciplinary perspectives, but all the people in the room, many of whom have PhDs but aren't working as faculty members, but who are just like think about things, and they're just humans. Like, some of their questions and interests were what made it really interesting to me, you know? So it's kind of like interdisciplinarity to another level. So not just people who are not in your field, but people who don't spend all of their time thinking about a particular field at all. But you know, so I really valued having the IAS people who are not fellows be part of those conversations. Those were the most interesting people to me at the IAS this term.